My wife became CEO after her father passed away. Just 5 days later, she fired me without knowing I actually owned 62% of the company. She thought she was in control, but Monday morning is going to be absolutely insane. Revenge has never felt so sweet. I never thought a funeral could feel like a battlefield. But there I stood, watching my own wife accept congratulations over her dead father's coffin, realizing in that exact moment they'd already started to erase me from everything I'd built. The air in that reception hall was thick with fake sympathy and something colder, a calculating ambition that made my skin crawl. Everyone seemed to be moving in a blur, except for the bitter clarity forming in my mind. The handshakes, the hushed condolences, the way people somehow delivered congratulations in the very same breath. Olivia's new executive team formed a protective circle around her, like I was some kind of threat instead of the man who'd worked 70-hour weeks to keep this company alive during the 2008 crisis. Back then, everyone else was ready to file for bankruptcy. Olivia stood there in her black Armani dress, accepting sympathy about her father, Walter, while simultaneously fielding questions about her strategic vision. I watched her skin the crowd with this cold, calculating look, completely skipping over me like I was invisible. Our son, Alex, was right beside her, 26 years old in his first real suit, nodding along with everything she said like he'd suddenly become her chief advisor overnight. I remembered when that kid couldn't even balance his college checkbook without calling me for help. My daughter, Sophia, caught my eye from across the room. There was a flash of confusion, maybe concern, in her expression, like she was the only person in that entire hall who realized something was fundamentally wrong with this picture. Walter had died on a Thursday morning, a massive heart attack at his desk. By Thursday afternoon, I'd already noticed my email access getting weird. Certain folders suddenly showed permission errors. My calendar invites to executive meetings bounced back with automated messages about organizational restructuring. Friday morning, I walked into the office. My assistant, Laura, looked at me with this horrible mixture of pity and awkwardness. When I asked her what was wrong, she just told me she wasn't my assistant anymore. They'd reassigned her to Alex that morning. Laura had been with me for 8 years, knew my coffee order better than I did, helped me close deals and manage crises. Now, she couldn't even meet my eyes because someone had clearly told her I was already gone. I walked down the hallway to the executive wing, noticing little things that individually meant nothing, but together painted a pretty clear picture. My name had been removed from department distribution lists. Weekly strategy meetings were rescheduled without me. People suddenly got very busy, very interested in their phones, whenever I walked past. Saturday was the funeral. I watched Olivia work the room like a political candidate at a fundraiser, dabbing at her eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief while simultaneously introducing Alex to board members as Walter's grandson and the future of the company. I was the one Walter called at 2 a.m. during the 2007 crisis when 3 of our biggest clients threatened to pull their contracts. I was the one who mortgaged my house and put my own money on the line when no bank would touch us. I was the one who personally flew to Dallas, Houston, and Philadelphia to save relationships everyone else had written off as dead. Walter used to introduce me at industry conferences as the man who saved his company. But apparently, that didn't count for much when DNA was involved. Sunday night, I got a text from Olivia. Not even a phone call, just a text saying we needed to discuss my transition plan first thing Monday morning at 9 a.m. sharp. I stared at that message, trying to figure out when my wife of 28 years had started communicating with me like I was some junior employee she'd never met before. Monday morning, I arrived at 7:30 like always. My keycard didn't work on the executive floor, it just kept beeping red at the security panel while the guard looked everywhere except at my face. My office looked exactly the same, but it felt like someone had already mentally cleared it out, just waiting for me to get the memo. When I logged into my computer, there was a calendar invite for 9 a.m. titled Organizational Transition Discussion with Olivia, Alex, and someone from HR I'd never even heard of. The meeting lasted exactly 12 minutes. Olivia used corporate language to deliver devastating personal blows, talking about restructuring for operational efficiency, aligning leadership with family succession planning, and ensuring legacy preservation through direct bloodline management. I just sat there, thinking about how this woman used to cry on my shoulder about her father's impossible expectations. Now she was using his death as a weapon against me. Alex wouldn't even look at me during the whole thing, just kept staring at his iPad like it contained the secrets of the universe. The HR person, this nervous woman named Sarah who'd literally started 3 weeks ago, kept apologizing while simultaneously pushing termination paperwork across the table. They were offering me 6 months severance, which sounds generous until you realize I'd personally generated about $40 million in saved costs and new revenue over the past decade and a half. Olivia actually said, "We think this is more than fair compensation for your contributions," with this bright, fake smile, like she was doing me some kind of favor. I signed the papers. What else was I going to do? As I walked back to my office to start packing, I passed the main conference room and saw them through the glass walls, literally removing my chair from the table while I was still in the building. Alex was directing the facilities guy where to take it, probably straight to storage or the dumpster. I felt sick watching my own son help erase me like I'd never existed. Olivia stood at the head of the table, testing out Walter's old chair, the big leather executive throne he'd custom-ordered from Italy. She spun around in it like a kid trying out a new toy. And I swear I saw her smile. That evening, I drove past the office around 7 p.m., because I'm apparently a glutton for punishment. Through the window, I watched Olivia pour herself a drink from Walter's private bar, the one with the 50-year-old scotch he'd been saving for a retirement he never got to have. She was sitting in his chair with her feet up on his desk like she'd finally taken her rightful throne. She raised her glass in this little private toast to herself, celebrating her victory over the man who'd actually built everything she was now claiming as her birthright. She didn't know that her father's office had a wall safe hidden behind the picture of her childhood home, installed during the 2007 renovations when everything was falling apart and he needed to protect the most important documents. She didn't know that I was the only other person besides him who knew the combination, or that he'd told me, "If anything ever happens to me, you'll need to open this," about 6 months before his heart gave out. She didn't know a lot of things, actually. And the emergency board meeting I was planning would be extremely educational for everyone involved. Monday evening, around 8 p.m., my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. When I answered, a voice said, "This is Thomas Miller. I was Walter's attorney, and I need you to come to my office first thing tomorrow morning." Something about the urgency in his tone made me agree immediately. Tuesday morning at 6:30, I walked into Thomas's downtown office. I found this old-school lawyer in his 70s sitting at a mahogany conference table covered in file folders he'd clearly been organizing since Walter's death. He slid a thick manila envelope across the table with my name written on it in Walter's handwriting. My hands started shaking before I even opened it. Inside was a letter dated 6 years ago, right after the company had finally stabilized from the 2008 crisis. Walter's first line said, "If you're reading this, I'm dead and Olivia has fired you, which means everything is going exactly as I feared it would." He explained that he'd watched his daughter become more concerned with status and control than actual business competence, and he'd realized that the moment he died, she tried to erase everyone who represented his actual legacy instead of just his DNA. Thomas pulled out another folder containing documents I'd barely thought about in years, investment papers from 2007. The company was 72 hours from complete bankruptcy, and Walter needed cash no bank would provide. I'd mortgaged my house, liquidated my retirement accounts, borrowed against everything I owned, and put in $2.3 million to keep the company alive. I remembered Walter insisting we structure it as equity rather than a loan. But at the time, I'd been so focused on survival that I hadn't paid attention to the legal details. Thomas showed me how that investment had been converted into preferred shares with specific voting rights and anti-dilution protections. Shares that had been placed in a protective trust that activated under certain conditions, including termination without cause by a family member serving as CEO. But that was just the beginning. Thomas pulled out a third folder containing trust documents and corporate restructuring papers that Walter had filed systematically over 6 years, reorganizing the ownership structure in ways I'd never known about. Thomas did the math on a legal pad, adding up my direct ownership from the 2007 investment, my trust positions that had activated when Olivia fired me, and my protected share allocations that Walter had built into the corporate structure. The number he circled at the bottom was 62%. I just stared at that number, thinking it had to be wrong. But Thomas explained that Walter hadn't given me anything. I'd earned every single share through my investment and my work. Walter had simply structured things legally to reflect that reality. The letter continued, with Walter writing about how he'd watched Alex grow up entitled and disconnected from real work, how he feared his family would treat the company like a trust fund instead of a living business that required constant skill and dedication. He wrote, "I'm not leaving my company to my bloodline. I'm protecting it for competence. And if Olivia fires you, it proves she values DNA over ability." Thomas explained that Walter had included Article 12, Section C, in the corporate bylaws, which allowed any shareholder holding more than 50% to call an extraordinary meeting with only 48 hours' notice. And that meeting could vote on anything, including board composition and executive appointments. He'd already prepared all the paperwork, already sent registered letters to all board members that morning notifying them of a meeting scheduled for Thursday at noon, and already submitted the ownership documentation to the corporate secretary, so there couldn't be any legal challenges. My phone started buzzing. I glanced down to see 17 missed calls from Olivia, 9 texts from Alex ranging from confused to panicked, and 3 voicemails from the CFO, Daniel Hayes, saying this couldn't be legal. Sophia had sent just one text that said, "Dad, I don't understand what's happening, but I believe in you." That message meant more to me than anything else. In that moment, Thomas told me that Olivia's attorneys had already called him twice, threatening lawsuits. But he'd calmly explained that every document was bulletproof, every filing was proper, and every share certificate was backed by solid corporate law precedent. He said Olivia was probably tearing through financial records right now, trying to understand how this was possible. When she found the original 2007 investment documents, she'd realize exactly how much she didn't know about her father's business decisions. I asked Thomas why Walter had never told me about any of this, why he'd let me work for 17 years thinking I was just an employee. Thomas smiled the sad smile and said Walter wanted me focused on running the company rather than worrying about ownership politics. He'd only wanted these protections to activate if the absolute worst happened. The worst apparently meant his daughter firing me 4 days after his funeral, which told me Walter had understood his own family better than I'd ever given credit for. I left Thomas's office around 10 a.m. and spent the rest of Tuesday and all of Wednesday watching my phone blow up with increasingly desperate messages from Olivia, trying to sound reasonable while clearly panicking behind the corporate speak. The CFO, Daniel Hayes, sent me the original 2007 documents with a message saying he'd found them in the archives, and now everything made sense. He wanted to know if his job was safe under new management. Alex left a voicemail that started angry and ended almost pleading, asking why I was doing this to the family. I deleted it without listening to the whole thing. Thursday morning at 11:30, I put on my best suit, the one I wore when we closed the Philadelphia deal that saved the company back in 2009. I drove to the office for what would be the most satisfying meeting of my entire career. I walked through the lobby and took the elevator to the executive floor. This time, when I pressed my key card to the reader, it beeped green. Thomas had made sure my access was restored under my new title as majority shareholder. I stood outside the conference room for a minute, watching through the glass as board members filed in, looking confused and nervous. Olivia sat at the head of the table, trying to project confidence while her hands shook slightly. Alex kept checking his phone, hoping for some last-minute miracle that would make this all go away. At exactly noon, I opened the door and walked in. Every single person in that room turned to look at me with expressions ranging from shock to fear to something that might have been respect. I realized that for the first time in my entire career at this company, I wasn't walking in as someone's employee, or someone's husband, or someone's father. I was walking in as the majority owner. And this meeting was going to be extremely educational for everyone involved. The trust administrator, this efficient woman named Eleanor Vance, stood at the front of the room with a projector showing the complete share breakdown. I watched Olivia's face go from red to white to this weird gray color as Eleanor methodically explained how my initial $2.3 million investment in 2007 had been structured as preferred shares, how those shares had been placed in a protective trust with specific triggering conditions, and how Walter had systematically restructured the ownership over 6 years to reflect what he called the actual value contribution of each stakeholder. Eleanor showed the paper trail, every filing with the Secretary of State, every corporate resolution the board had approved without really reading carefully, every trust document Walter's attorneys had prepared and stored in 3 separate secure locations. The total came to 62% ownership in my name. One of the board members, this guy named Gary Peterson, who'd been Walter's friend for 30 years, actually laughed in this shocked disbelief way and said, "Walter, you magnificent bastard," like he was talking to a ghost. I think everyone in that room suddenly understood that this wasn't some hostile takeover. This was Walter's final lesson to his daughter about the difference between inheritance and competence. The vote to remove Olivia as CEO took about 3 minutes. It was unanimous, except for Alex, who abstained because even he realized that voting to keep his mother in power would just make him look worse. Olivia didn't cry or yell or make a scene. She just sat there staring at the table like she was trying to find some loophole in the wood grain. When the vote was done, she stood up very slowly and walked out without saying a single word. Alex followed her after giving me this look that was half anger and half something else. Maybe the first glimpse of understanding that actions actually have consequences. The CFO, Daniel Hayes, who'd been with the company for 12 years, asked if he could speak privately. We went into the smaller conference room where he pulled out a folder he'd clearly been hiding until he knew which way the wind was blowing. He showed me financial irregularities he'd discovered over the past 6 months, expense reports that didn't match actual company spending, transfers from the pension fund to executive discretionary accounts. Basically, a pattern of embezzlement that Olivia had apparently thought was her right as CEO. Daniel said he'd been documenting everything because something felt wrong, but he'd been too afraid of Olivia to bring it to anyone's attention while she had power. Now he was handing it over because he'd worked too hard on the pension fund to watch someone steal from people's retirement. The amounts weren't massive, maybe $300,000 total, but it was federal fraud when you touched pension money. Thomas immediately said we needed to report it and launch a full audit. I told Daniel he was keeping his job and actually getting promoted to vice president of finance because the company needed people with integrity. The relief on his face was almost painful to watch. We spent the next week doing damage control, bringing in external auditors, notifying the appropriate authorities, and basically undoing 6 months of Olivia's leadership decisions that had prioritized image over substance. Alex got fired 3 days later after we discovered he'd been approving expense reports without reviewing them, just rubber stamping whatever his mother put in front of him. When I told him he was being let go, he actually had the nerve to say I was destroying the family legacy. I looked at my son, this kid I'd raised and supported and tried to teach about responsibility. I told him, character isn't inherited, it's built. And you chose to build yours on shortcuts and blind loyalty instead of competence and integrity. He left my office without responding, because what could he possibly say? Sophia came to see me that Friday evening. We sat in my office with the door closed while she asked me to explain everything from the beginning. I walked her through the whole story from 2007 to now. She listened without interrupting. When I was done, she told me that Olivia was moving out of the house, renting a condo downtown, and she wanted Sophia to choose sides. I told her she didn't have to choose anything, that this was business and legal consequences, even though we both knew that was partially a lie, because you can't separate business betrayal from personal betrayal when the business is family-owned. The story hit the business press about a week later. Some reporter got hold of the board meeting minutes and wrote an article about silent partnerships and posthumous corporate strategy. Suddenly my phone was full of LinkedIn messages and interview requests. Someone even turned it into a meme with the caption, "When you fire your father-in-law's business partner and find out he owns 62%. Olivia apparently deactivated all her social media accounts because she couldn't handle everyone knowing she'd been outmaneuvered by her dead father. The company's actually doing better now than it has in years. Revenues are up 18%. Employee morale improved because people appreciate leadership that focuses on results instead of politics. And we just landed 2 major contracts that Olivia's team had been bundling for months. I kept Olivia on as a minority shareholder because that's what Walter's documents specified. So she still gets her dividends and still technically owns part of the family business, but she has zero operational control and zero voting power. And I think that bothers her more than losing the money would have. Sometimes late at night, I pour myself a drink from Walter's Scotch collection, the one Olivia thought she'd inherited. I sit in his office, looking at the picture that hid the wall safe. I think about how he spent 6 years building this elaborate protection system because he loved his company enough to save it from his own daughter. Walter didn't leave his business to his bloodline. He left it to competence. And that's probably the most valuable lesson anyone in this family could have learned, even if some of them had to learn it the hardest way possible. Sophia stopped by yesterday and told me she's applying for a junior analyst position in our finance department. She wants to earn her way up like I did, rather than coast on the family name like Alex tried to do. I looked at my daughter and saw something I hadn't seen in years, this genuine fire and ambition that had nothing to do with entitlement and everything to do with wanting to prove herself. And I realized that maybe Walter's lesson hadn't just been for Olivia. Maybe it had been for all of us. A reminder that legacy isn't something you inherit. It's something you build one decision at a time. And the only thing that matters in the end is whether you built it with integrity or shortcuts, with competence or connections, with your own hands or someone else's work. Olivia will never understand that, and Alex probably won't either, but Sophia gets it. And that gives me hope that maybe Walter's real legacy isn't the company or the shares or the legal documents. Maybe it's the lesson that character and competence matter more than bloodline. And that lesson is worth more than any inheritance could ever be. What would you have done in my situation?